Welcome back, everyone. Pretty excited today. We have a lot to do. We pulled out the Dana 60 from underneath the Suburban. Look closely and you'll see it's very disgusting. It's greasy, it's old, it's used, and only half welded. Today we get to change that. We got all these fancy parts from Yukon Gear and Axle. They supplied us with an entire rebuild kit, a new locker, a new diff cover, some hubs, sweet Chrome-Moly axles. We're going to completely rebuild this thing, and you get to follow along. So we're on the passenger side of the axle. We're gonna start by taking off the brakes. We're gonna get the locking hub taken off, take out the spindle nuts, get the bearing off, take the rotor off, get to the axle, take that out, and take the knuckle off. Here goes nothing. But the snap ring wasn't on. That's always a lovely surprise to see. Pull the hub off and your snap ring falls off. Make sure when you're doing this you have plenty of rags handy. Because if somebody at least tried to take care of the axle, it's going to have a whole lot of grease in it. Okay, I'm putting 2 of the bolts back in just to make it easy to pull the rest of the hub out here in just a second. Got to get the outer snap ring out. Ooh. I guess I won't be reusing that one. Cool. Nice. I'm not very familiar with mile marker hubs, but I'm pretty sure that shouldn't just come apart. Looks like there's supposed to be a lock ring right there. Whenever you go to take out your spindle nuts, the first one, take out your spindle nut and then there's going to be a spacer. Your second spindle nut is going to have a little stud sticking off of it, or should, and that's what's going to line up with one of the holes on here. In the event you don't have one of these here spindle nut sockets, you can do the old-fashioned way of taking off the spindle nut. You got to be careful with it because you don't want to damage any of the threads in there or the nut themselves. But you get yourself a flathead and a hammer. You get on one of the teeth inside of there and just lightly start to work it around. If it was torqued properly, it's going to be a little bit difficult. If it's old and worn, won't be too bad. But as you can see, works like a charm. Get the front bearing out of there, or get the outer bearing out. Set that aside. And pull your rotor assembly off. Next up, we're going to take off the dust shield and the brake the brake caliper bracket so we can get the spindle off and get the axle shaft out. We'll see. When you're taking off your spindle, there's multiple ways you can do it. There's the proper tool that I've never used, some kind of weird little slide hammer thing. You can take a chisel and hammer and come right around the backside to separate it. Just work it all the way around. Or, if you have faith, get yourself a mallet. Make sure it's a mallet, not a hammer. Hold on to this bad boy and pull. While you're in there, may as well go ahead and replace that bearing and do some cleaning. If you get new axles and you didn't get new seals, if your old ones are still in good condition, you could go ahead and reuse them. Just take them off, make sure you clean them real well, check for any cracks, tears, anything obvious on a rubber seal. Take your axle shaft out. Now if all you're doing is going to be changing out wheel bearings or axle shafts, something along those lines, you don't necessarily have to go as far as we are. The reason we're doing this is, if you look at this, I mentioned it was dirty and greasy. It's really disgusting. So we're going to take everything apart, get all the grease off, clean it up real good, or as good as we can, paint it, hopefully make it pretty. Never forget, Chrome won't get you home. We're on to the differential now. We're going to be pulling the open diff out. We got to get the ring gear off of the open diff and put it on the new Yukon Grizzly locker. If you're unfamiliar with the benefits of a locker, an open diff, you can go off-roading in it. You know, you get through most mall parking lots. But with a locker, you get through all the mall parking lots. Alright, as I mentioned, we said we were going to finish welding this up. We still got to do the half of the truss that's touching the differential. The differential is cast, and we're welding with mild steel. So we need to preheat the cast, and then slowly let it cool by putting a welding blanket over top of it. We're going to heat it up to about 400 degrees, then weld it. Try not to die. And slowly let it cool. We spent a lot of time while this was cooling cleaning off a bunch of the other parts, chiseling all the grease and everything off. So next up we're going to be pulling the pinion out. We're going to take the old carrier, get the ring gear off of it, pull the bearings off of it to make some setup bearings for the locker that's going in here. Try to make the job a little bit easier.
In our Yukon Master Overhaul kit, we have brand new bearings and races, some seals, and we also have an entire shim set for the carrier and also the pinion. So we have them all laid out here, some calipers ready at hand. We're going to match what the original carrier had, drop it in there, try it out, and see if we need to make any changes from there. So the pinion is installed with the new bearing on the inner. The outer bearing is still a setup bearing because we still need to check the pattern. We have setup bearings on the carrier with shim stacks matching what the original ones were that we pulled out. Dropped it in there, tightened everything up. We're going to put some paint on it and then run it through. We'll have to check the pattern, and we also need to check our backlash as well. So since our backlash wasn't in spec, to decrease it, we need to move the ring gear closer to the pinion. We're going to subtract shims away from the ring gear and add them on the ring gear side, and it should move it over.
Yeah.
How much are we going to move?
You want to do 10 or 5?
Let's do 10 because it was 30 out. It would be nice to have a case spreader. We don't have one, but we do have 2 pry bars and 4 arms, so you just apply some pressure. So 10 from that side to the ring gear side. Bring her in.
Yeah, get a case spreader. This sucks.
We just checked the backlash again. We are within spec now, so we painted some more teeth. We're going to run it through, check the pattern. Hopefully we're right where we need to be. Looks beautiful. Beautiful.
It's a happy pattern.
So we are happy with this pattern. What we have to do now, take it apart and do it all over again.
We got to take it apart, take off all our setup bearings, and press all the new ones on there. Put it back into position, and continue on. Probably check it again.
Yep.
And then continue pressing on with everything else.
Let's take it apart, put the real bearings on there, and proceed.
We got the locker installed, gears set up nicely. Now we're putting on the Yukon Hardcore cover. I want to mention a couple things about this. For one, it looks beefy as hell. It's nice, it's thick, looks strong. It's made of nodular iron, so anybody familiar with the Ford 9-inch and your selection for third members, we know nodular iron's very sought after. Not only that, but it comes with both a fill plug and a drain plug. Both with magnets in them. Very nice. Alright, now we get to install the axle shafts. Again, these are the 4340 Chrome-Moly shafts. The material they're made of is far superior than what the stock axles are. And as you can see by the stub shafts, we have the 35 spline outers now, as opposed to the 30 splines that came stock in it. With this setup, I'd feel much more confident running 37s or larger on this axle now. Alright, we're almost done with the axle. We get to install the Yukon Hardcore Locking hubs now. I did want to take a moment to go over, kind of compare the Yukon hubs that I'm putting on now to the mile marker hubs that I'm pulling off. The Hardcore Locking hubs, we understand how they get their name. You know, hardcore. We say how they're like miniature Spartan lockers. I mean, if you've ever seen a Spartan locker before, you'd see the way they engage each other is exactly the same way. Another great benefit to the Yukon hubs, as you can see, they're quite a bit more narrow than the mile marker hub. I'd say there's about a 3/4 inch difference. So hub to hub is going to be more narrow. For me, that's a benefit because I'm running the H1 wheels, and they haven't been recentered, so my wheels stick in quite a bit. With the Yukon hub, I'm much less likely to bash it on something because it won't stick out as far. The material they're made out of, again, far superior. The Yukon hubs are made of chromoly. If you look at this mile marker one, it's like a plastic aluminum mix of some sort. I don't know what it's made out of, but it definitely doesn't feel like this bad boy. Before you start, you can either cover everything in grease or you can do it during the assembly. Because of the wind out here, I'll do it one at a time so I don't just have dirt piling up on all my pieces. Yeah, first thing we have to do is install our spring retainer into the hub. And if you look at it, you have a lip recess on one side and it's flat on the other. Make sure the flat side is pointing out towards you when you install it. The next step is to install your spring, followed by your spacer. The spacer is going to go over the axle stub all the way against your spindle. Me personally, I like to put the spacer on first because fitting your hand inside the spring isn't the easiest thing to do. Got the spacer in place. Now the spring's on, and you want to check and verify that your spring can push all the way in without binding on the hub or the axle assembly. Next up, you're going to coat your coupler and your driver with grease and then install them. Now that we have those all nice and greased up, we're going to go ahead and slide this in here as an assembly. So you're going to put the driver over the axle, and you may have to turn your hub a little bit to get the coupler lined up, and then you just push it in. You're going to have to hold it there because you have that spring fighting against you. At that point, you take your snap ring and you battle with it to get it on there. It may require another set of hands, otherwise get creative. Once you get your snap ring installed, go ahead and push in on that driver and verify that the snap ring is seated all the way inside the groove on the axle. If it's not fully seated, then you risk that popping back out at you. You're going to install the cam spacer inside your retainer plate. Again, make sure you put plenty of grease on here. Alright, now we're going to put that in there. And it says a little bit of force may be required to get it to seat in there far enough. Then you take your hub snap ring and install that. And again, once you get that snap ring in there, push in on it just to verify that it's fully seated. Once you get your snap ring installed, take 2 fingers and push in on that cam spacer a couple times. Make sure it goes in and out freely, it doesn't get snagged on anything, and it doesn't bind on your plate. Next up, you're going to take your selector. You're going to lube up the O-ring on it You're going to insert it into the bezel. And before you go any further, just take a moment to appreciate the beauty of this. When you go to install this, make sure that your selector is lined up to the locked position. You can see on the back, your openings will line up. Line it up. When you're installing this, it shouldn't take any force whatsoever to put the bezel and selector onto the hub. If it does require force to get it in there, you've done something wrong. You need to take it back apart and check it. Suggested torque for the bezel bolts is going to be 22 inch-pounds. If you just crank it down, over torque it, it can result in improper functioning. Make sure you can move it to the free position, and it actually spins freely. Rotate it to the lock position. Well, there we have it, folks. That's how you take an old nasty Dana 60 and make it almost new again. Thanks again to Yukon for supplying us with all the parts. Huge help. We're just about done with the front end. We got all the links painted up. We still got to do bump stops, get the coilovers back in place, make some adjustments, and then move on to the rear suspension. All coming up, so stay tuned.
If you guys liked this episode and learned something, hit that like button. Comment down below what you want to see next on this thing. We got a lot of work coming up on the rear end, so tell us what you want to see. Otherwise, hit the subscribe button, stick around, and we'll see you guys later.